You're 32 and still single. What's wrong with you?" That was my mother's voice cutting through the Sunday dinner table like a blade through silk, her fork suspended midair as she delivered the blow that would echo in my chest for years to come. My father didn't even look up from his meatloaf, just nodded in agreement, like they were discussing the weather and not dismantling their daughter's worth piece by piece. My name is Andrea Miranda, and if you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, I need you to stay with me because what I'm about to share will change how you see family expectations forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out, and my sister Jessica, who was sitting across from me with her perfect husband and their 2 perfect children, just smiled. That knowing smile, the one that said she'd won the game, I didn't even know we were playing. Mom continued her assault, without missing a beat. You know, Mrs Henderson from down the street. Her daughter got married at 25 and already has 3 kids. What have you been doing with your life, Andrea? Just chasing fantasies and refusing to settle down like a normal person? Would Dad finally joined the conversation with his usual warmth and compassion, which is to say, none at all. No man wants a woman who thinks she's too good for everyone. You've priced yourself out of the market. Sweetheart, time to lower your standards before you end up alone forever. I sat there in my childhood dining room, surrounded by the same floral wallpaper that had witnessed every milestone of my life, the same wooden table where I'd done homework and eaten birthday cake and announced my college acceptance, and now it was witnessing my execution by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The roast beef on my plate grew cold as I absorbed each word, each dismissive glance, each confirmation that in their eyes I was broken, goods past my expiration. Data cautionary tale they'd tell neighbors about what happens when daughters get too independent, too picky, too comfortable being alone. Jessica leaned forward with false concern painted across her face. "Andrea, honey, they're just worried about you've been single for 3 years now since David, and that relationship was barely serious anyway. Maybe it's time to consider that your standards might be a little unrealistic. Look at you. You're not getting any younger." The room felt smaller with each passing second, like the walls were closing in and the oxygen was running out. I could feel my cheeks burning, not from embarrassment, but from rage. Pure, unadulterated rage at being reduced to my relationship status. Like everything else I'd accomplished meant nothing because I didn't have a ring on my finger. Mom set down her fork and fixed me with that look, the one she reserved for difficult conversations and unsatisfactory report cards. "Andrea, we love you, but we're concerned you spend too much time traveling. Too much time with those artsy friends of yours. Too much time living in a fantasy world instead of focusing on what really matters. Finding a good man, settling down. Having children, like normal. Women, do you act like you're some kind of princess waiting for Prince Charming, but real life doesn't work that way, sweetheart. You need to wake up and smell the coffee before it's too late." Dad cleared his throat and delivered what he thought was wisdom, but felt like a death sentence. "You know what your problem is, Andrea. You read too many fairy tales as a kid, got too many ideas about romance and adventure. Now you think you're too good for regular guys, regular life. But let me tell you something. Princess real men don't want a woman who thinks she's better than them. They want someone humble, someone grateful, someone who knows her place. And frankly, at your age, you should be grateful anyone decent would even look at you twice." Jessica nodded enthusiastically like she was watching her favorite television show instead of her sister being systematically destroyed. "Oh, absolutely. My friend Karen, she's only 28, and she's already worried about being left behind. You're 32, Andrea. That's practically middle-aged in dating years. You really need to start saying yes to guys. You might not be crazy about because, honestly, what choice do you have at this point?" I felt something crack inside me. Something that had been holding me together for years. suddenly giving way under the pressure of their collective disappointment. I looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA, but clearly didn't share my dreams, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I didn't recognize them anymore. Or maybe I was finally seeing them for who they'd always been, small-minded people living small lives, who couldn't fathom that someone might want something bigger, something different, something more than what they'd settled for. Mom continued her lecture, apparently unaware that she was speaking to someone who had already mentally left the building. "You know what we should do? We should set you up with Harold from church. He's divorced, but he's got a steady job and he's not picky. Plus, he's got kids already. So if things work out, you wouldn't have to worry about the whole biological clock thing. It's perfect, really. He needs someone to help with the kids, and you need someone to validate your existence. It's a win-win situation." The suggestion hit me like a slap across the face. Harold from church was a nice enough man, but he was also boring as watching paint dry with breath that smelled like coffee and cigarettes and a tendency to interrupt women mid-sentence to explain things they already knew. But apparently my family thought I should be grateful for his attention, grateful for the opportunity to become an instant stepmother to his 3 unruly children. Grateful to be chosen by anyone, even if that someone made me want to hide in the bathroom at social gatherings just to escape his endless monologues about fishing and car repairs. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself like he'd just solved world hunger, instead of suggesting I marry the most boring man in Ohio. That's actually not a bad idea. Linda Harold's a good man, steady, reliable. He's got his own house and a pension plan. What more could you want at your age? Andrea, you're not exactly in a position to be choosy anymore. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to run out of that house and never come back. But instead, I just sat there absorbing their words, like a sponge soaking up poison. Because part of me, the part that had been conditioned since childhood to seek their approval, was wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was being too picky, too romantic, too unrealistic. Maybe at 32 I should be grateful for any man who would have me, even if he made me feel dead inside, even if spending 5 minutes in his presence made me want to claw my way out of my own skin. Maybe this was what growing up meant, accepting less than what you dreamed of, because dreams were for children, and I was no longer a child. Jessica, sensing my weakness, moved in for the kill. "You know, Andrea, I think you've watched too many movies, read too many romance novels. You're waiting for some perfect man who doesn't exist, some knight in shining armor who's going to sweep you off your feet and make you feel special. But that's not how real relationships work. Real relationships are about compromise, about settling, about making the best of what you can get. And honestly, you're running out of time to figure that out." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The word settling echoed in my mind like a death knell, because that's what they were asking me to do. Settle for less than what made me happy. Settle for a life that felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. Settle for being grateful instead of being cherished. And I realized in that moment that I would rather be alone forever than spend one day in a relationship that made me feel small and insignificant and apologetic for existing. Mom must have seen something in my expression, because her tone softened slightly, became more manipulative, more dangerous. "Oh, sweetheart, I know this is hard to hear, but we're only saying these things because we love you, because we want what's best for you, and what's best for you is finding a nice man who will take care of you, who will give you the security and stability you need to be happy. We don't want you to end up like your Aunt Margaret, bitter and alone with nothing but cats for company. Is that what you want? Andrea, is that the life you're choosing?" Aunt Margaret had always been my favorite relative, the one who traveled the world and spoke 3 languages and had stories that made family gatherings actually interesting. But apparently in my family's eyes, she was a cautionary tale, a woman who had chosen independence over marriage, adventure over security, and had somehow ended up broken because of it. Never mind that she seemed happier than most of the married women I knew. Never mind that she had friends all over the world and a passport full of stamps and eyes that sparkled when she talked about her latest discoveries. She was single and therefore tragic in their narrow world view. Dad finished his beer and delivered his final verdict with the authority of someone who had never questioned a single assumption in his entire life. Look, Andrea, we're not trying to be mean. We're trying to be realistic. You're not a young woman anymore. You're not some beauty queen who can afford to be picky. You're an average-looking 32-year-old with a mediocre job and no prospects. It's time to lower your expectations and start appreciating what you can get. Because frankly, you're not in a position to hold out for some fairy tale romance that's never going to happen. The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to chip away at whatever self-worth I had left. Average-looking, mediocre job, no prospects, as if my entire existence could be reduced to a dating profile that no one would swipe right on as if my worth as a human being was determined solely by my ability to attract and keep a man, as if everything I'd accomplished, everything I'd worked for, everything I dreamed of, meant nothing because I didn't have a wedding ring to validate my existence. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, because breaking would mean admitting they were right. And I knew with every fiber of my being that they were wrong even if I couldn't articulate why, even if their words were finding cracks in my armor and settling there like poison. Jessica reached across the table and patted my hand with condescending gentleness, the same way she might comfort a child who had just learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. Andrea, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but sometimes the people who love us have to tell us the hard truths. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for Prince Charming and start appreciating the nice normal men who are actually available. Maybe it's time to grow up and join the real world, instead of living in whatever fantasy you've created for yourself. And honestly, I think you'd be happier if you just accepted reality and stopped fighting against what everyone can see except you. She squeezed my hand tighter like she was trying to transfer some of her smugness. Through her fingertips, you know what you should do. You should make a list of all the things you think you want in a man, and then cross off half of them because, honey, you're not in a position to be making demands anymore. The conversation continued around me like I was no longer present, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. They discussed my romantic failures, like they were analyzing a failed business venture, pinpointing exactly where I had gone wrong and how I might salvage something from the wreckage of my expectations. They talked about my biological clock like it was a ticking time bomb that would explode if I didn't immediately throw myself at the first available man. They discussed my appearance, my personality, my career choices, all through the lens of how these things affected my marriage ability. As if I existed solely to be chosen by someone else, as if my own dreams and desires were secondary to my ability to make myself palatable to the opposite sex. And through it all, I sat there feeling smaller and smaller, like I was disappearing into the floral upholstery of my childhood dining room chair. Mom started clearing the dishes with the brisk efficiency of someone who had just solved a major problem. Well, I'm glad we had this talk, Andrea. I think it's exactly what you needed to hear, and I want you to promise me that you'll really think about what we've said tonight. Promise me you'll consider Harold, or at least start being more open to the men who show interest in you. Because sweetheart time is not on your side, and we won't always be here to help you figure these things out. You need to start taking responsibility for your own happiness, and that means making some compromises, making some mature decisions about what really matters in life. Dad nodded approvingly, like they had just performed some great service, like they had rescued me from a burning building instead of setting fire to my self-esteem, and Harold really is a good option. Andrea, he's stable, he's available, and he's interested. What more do you need at this point in your life? Romance is for teenagers. Marriage is about partnership, about building a life together, about being practical. I finally found my voice. Though it came out smaller than I intended, quieter than I felt. I don't want to marry Harold. I don't want to settle for someone who makes me feel nothing. I want to find someone who makes me feel alive. Someone who sees me as more than just a convenience. Someone who loves me for who I am not because he needs a babysitter for his children, and I don't think that makes me unrealistic. I think that makes me human. The silence that followed was deafening. Like I had just confessed to a crime instead of expressing a basic desire for genuine connection. Jessica was the first to respond with a laugh that held no humor. "Oh, Andrea, you're still living in a dream world, still waiting for some perfect man to come rescue you from your boring life. But that's not how it works in the real world. Real love isn't about feeling alive or being swept off your feet. It's about finding someone who will put up with you and building a life together, even if it's not exciting, even if it's not what you imagined when you were young and stupid." The word stupid hung in the air like a slap, and I realized that's how they saw me: stupid for wanting more than they had settled for. Stupid for believing I deserved to be cherished rather than merely tolerated. Stupid for thinking that love should feel like coming home rather than serving a prison sentence. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Something that had been bending under the weight of their expectations finally snapped back into place with a clarity that surprised me. I looked around the table at these people who claimed to love me, but were systematically destroying my sense of self-worth, and I made a decision that would change everything. I stood up slowly, deliberately, and tucked my chair back under the table, with the same careful precision I had been taught as a child. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "But I think it's time for me to go." Mom looked startled, like she hadn't expected me to have an opinion about my own dismissal. "Oh, Andrea, don't be dramatic. We're just trying to help you see things clearly, trying to save you from making mistakes that will leave you alone and miserable. We're your family. We want what's best for you. And what's best for you is facing reality, instead of chasing impossible dreams that will only lead to disappointment and regret. You need to listen to people who have more experience than you do. People who understand how the world actually works." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly annoyed that I wasn't accepting their wisdom with the gratitude they felt it deserved. "Now don't go getting all sensitive, Andrea. We're not trying to hurt. Your feelings were trying to wake you up before it's too late, before you end up a bitter old woman with nothing but regrets and cats for company like your Aunt Margaret. Is that what you want?" I picked up my purse and my keys, feeling strangely calm despite the chaos in my chest. "I want to be happy," I said simply. "And I don't think that's too much to ask for. I don't think wanting to find someone who actually likes me is unrealistic. I don't think hoping for a relationship that feels like a choice rather than a surrender makes me stupid or naive. And I definitely don't think I should have to apologize for believing I deserve better than Harold from church." Jessica rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh my God! Andrea, you're being ridiculous. Nobody gets the perfect relationship. Nobody finds their soulmate. That's fairy tale nonsense. Real adults make compromises. Real adults accept good enough because good enough is all anyone gets. If you keep holding out for some imaginary perfect man, you're going to end up with nothing, and then you'll realize we were right all along, but it will be too late to do anything about it." I walked toward the front door, feeling like I was moving through water. Everything seemed surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion behind me. I could hear them discussing my dramatic exit like it was further proof of my immaturity, my refusal to face facts, my stubborn insistence on living in a fantasy world. But their voices grew fainter with each step I took toward the door, toward freedom, toward whatever waited for me outside this house that had never really felt like home anyway. I paused at the threshold and turned back one last time to look at my family sitting around that familiar table under the same light fixture that had illuminated thousands of meals, thousands of conversations, thousands of moments that had shaped me into who I was. And I realized that who I wasn't someone who would ever be satisfied with Harold from church, or anyone else who saw me as better than nothing, rather than worth everything. "I hope you find happiness," I said. And I meant it. Despite everything, I hoped they would find peace in their small, safe world of lowered expectations and practical choices, but I also knew with absolute certainty that their world wasn't big enough. For me, wasn't bright enough for the dreams I carried, wasn't strong enough to hold the love I knew I deserved, even if I had to wait longer to find it, even if I had to disappoint them, even if I had to disappoint myself by refusing to become who they needed me to be in order to feel comfortable with their own choices. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the sound of their voices, the weight of their expectations, and the girl who would have married, Harold from church just to make everyone else happy. What they didn't know as I drove away from that house with tears streaming down my face and my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces was that 3 months earlier, I had met someone who made me understand why nothing had ever worked out. Before, someone who looked at me like I was exactly what he had been searching for his entire life. Someone who made me feel like I was coming alive for the first time in my 32 years. Someone whose very existence proved that every relationship I had ever walked away from had been preparing me for this moment for him, for the love that felt like coming home, and setting out on an adventure all at the same time. And what they definitely didn't know was that this someone happened to be Prince Alexander of Monaco, and that in my purse next to my keys and my lipstick was an engagement ring worth more than their house. The truth was, I had been living a double life for months, and the weight of that secret was both exhilarating and terrifying in ways I never could have imagined when I first walked into that small art gallery in Manhattan 3 months ago. I had been there for my friend Emma's photography exhibition. Nothing more than a casual Saturday afternoon supporting a friend who had finally gotten her break in the competitive New York art scene. I was wearing my favorite burgundy dress, the one that made me feel confident and sophisticated even though it came from a department store clearance rack, and I had spent exactly $43 on it, including tax. I remember the price because I had debated for 20 minutes whether I could afford it, whether it was worth stretching my budget for something I might only wear once. But something about that dress made me feel like I could conquer the world, or at least survive a crowded gallery opening filled with pretentious art critics and wannabe collectors. I was standing in front of Emma's photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, studying the way she had captured the light filtering through the cables, when I felt someone approach from behind, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of presence that makes you aware of being watched in the most delicious way possible. I turned around expecting to see another gallery patron ready to discuss the technical aspects of Emma's composition, and instead found myself looking into the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen. They were the color of stormy seas, dark blue with flecks of gray that seemed to shift depending on the light, and they belonged to a man who looked like he had stepped out of a European fashion magazine, tall, with dark hair. That was perfectly imperfect, and a smile that suggested he knew secrets that would change your life, if only you were brave enough to ask. He was wearing a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, nothing flashy or obviously expensive, but something about the way the clothes fit him, the way he carried himself, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin, told me this was not an ordinary man. This was someone accustomed to being looked at, being noticed, being wanted. And yet when he looked at me, it was with a focus and intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the crowded gallery like everyone else had simply vanished, leaving just the two of us standing in front of Emma's photograph, trying to find words for something that felt bigger than language could contain. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was like warm honey with just a hint of an accent. I couldn't quite place something. European. Definitely. Something that made ordinary words sound like poetry. I couldn't help but notice you've been studying this photograph for quite some time, and I was wondering if you might share your thoughts about it with a fellow admirer of beautiful things. The way he said beautiful things while looking directly at me made my cheeks flush in a way that hadn't happened since high school, and I found myself stammering like a teenager on her first date trying to form coherent thoughts about Emma's work, while simultaneously trying to process the fact that this impossibly attractive stranger was standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made me want to lean closer, Just to breathe him in, I managed to pull together some reasonably intelligent comments about Emma's use of natural light and her ability to capture the soul of the city in a single frame. And he listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like every word I spoke was worth remembering, worth treasuring, worth filing away for future reference when I finished my impromptu art critique. He smiled that devastating smile again and extended his hand. "My name is Alexander," he said, "and I have to say your insights into photography are almost as captivating as you are." The handshake lasted longer than socially acceptable, and I found myself reluctant to let go of his warm, strong fingers that felt like they had been designed specifically to fit with mine. "I'm Andrea," I managed to say, hoping my voice didn't betray how affected I was by his proximity, his attention, his entire presence, which seemed to fill the space around us with electricity and possibility. "And I have to say your pickup lines are almost as smooth as your accent, which I still can't identify. By the way, are you going to keep me guessing, or are you going to tell me where that voice comes from? Because it's doing dangerous things to my ability to think straight." He laughed. Then a rich, warm sound that made other people in the gallery turn to look at us with curiosity and perhaps a touch of envy, and I realized that he was the kind of man who drew attention without trying, the kind of man who made other women wonder what it would be like to be the one he was talking to. "Monaco," he said simply, as if that single word explained everything, and perhaps it did. Because suddenly, the accent, the confidence, the way he moved through the world, like he owned it all, made perfect sense. "Monaco, where my family has lived for generations, and where I spend most of my time when I'm not traveling for work. And what kind of work brings you to New York?" I asked, genuinely curious about what could pull someone away from what I imagined was a pretty spectacular home life in one of the most beautiful places on earth. "Diplomatic relations?" "Mostly," he said with a slight smile that suggested there was more to the story, but also that he wasn't ready to share those details with someone he had just met. "Some cultural exchanges, some business meetings. Nothing too exciting really, though. Meeting you has definitely made this trip worth the jet lag." The comment was clearly intended to flatter, but there was something in his eyes that made me believe he meant it. Something that made me feel like he was as surprised by our connection as I was. We spent the next 2 hours walking through the gallery, discussing Emma's work and art in general, and gradually moving into more personal territory. Our favorite books, our travel dreams, our thoughts on everything from Italian cuisine to the best way to spend a rainy Sunday morning. And with every passing minute, I felt myself falling deeper into something that felt dangerous and wonderful, and completely outside my previous experience with men. He was intelligent without being condescending, charming without being manipulative, interested without being overwhelming. And when he talked about his life in Monaco, his eyes lit up in a way that made me want to see the places he described, to walk the streets he knew, to understand the world that had shaped him into this fascinating, complicated man who seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. When Emma finally found us, we were sitting on a bench in the gallery courtyard, sharing stories about our most embarrassing childhood moments and laughing like old friends who had found each other again. After years apart, Emma took one look at us, at the way we were sitting closer than strangers usually do, at the way we couldn't seem to stop smiling at each other, and she raised an eyebrow in that knowing way that best friends have when they recognize something significant happening right in front of them. "Well, well," she said, settling onto the bench across from us. "Looks like my art exhibition was good for more than just my career. Andrea, I hate to interrupt what appears to be a very intense conversation, but the gallery is closing in 10 minutes, and I promised to help them pack up the remaining pieces." Alexander stood immediately, with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed natural rather than performed. "Of course," he said, "I wouldn't want to keep you from your obligations, Emma. And thank you for sharing your incredible work tonight. Your photographs capture something essential about this city, something that most people miss entirely." Emma beamed at the compliment, and I could see her photographer's eye taking in Alexander's appearance, his clothes, his posture, the way he commanded attention without trying, and I knew she would have questions later. Lots of questions about where I had found this man and whether I had any intention of seeing him again, questions I wasn't sure I could answer. Because despite the amazing evening we had shared, I still knew almost nothing concrete about his life beyond the fact that he lived in Monaco and worked in something vaguely related to diplomacy. For all I knew, he could be married or engaged or involved with someone else. For all I knew, this could be how he spent every business trip charming local women in art galleries and then disappearing back to his real life without a second thought. The possibility made my stomach clench with unexpected anxiety, because somehow, in the space of 2 hours, this stranger had become important to me in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. As we prepared to leave, Alexander turned to me with an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. Despite his obvious confidence, "Andrea, I know this might sound presumptuous since we've only just met, but I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tomorrow night. I know a place that serves the most incredible French cuisine, and I would love to continue our conversation in a setting where we don't have to worry about galleries closing or interrupting your friend's important evening." The invitation was casual enough, but something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at me like my answer mattered more than he wanted to admit, made me realize that this wasn't just polite small talk. This was something real. Something that had the potential to change everything. If I was brave enough to say yes, I glanced at Emma, who was pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word, and then back at Alexander, who was waiting for my response with the kind of patience that suggested he understood the weight of what he was asking. "Yes," I said before I could overthink it, before I could talk myself out of taking a chance on something that felt bigger and more significant than anything I had experienced before. "Yes, I would love to have dinner with you tomorrow night." His smile, in response, was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, brilliant and warm and full of promise, and I felt something shift inside me, something that had been locked away for years, suddenly opening like a flower, reaching toward light. "I'll pick you up at 7, he said, pulling out his phone to exchange contact information. "And Andrea, thank you for making what started as a routine business trip into something I'll remember for the rest of my life." The words were simple, but the way he said them, the way he looked at me when he said them, made me feel like I was precious, like I was someone worth remembering, worth pursuing, worth the kind of effort that most men seemed incapable of making. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, replaying every moment of our conversation, every look, every touch of his hand against mine, when he helped me navigate the crowded gallery. Every laugh we had shared over stories that weren't even particularly funny, but became hilarious in the warm glow of unexpected connection. I tried to tell myself that I was being ridiculous, that I was reading too much into what was probably just a pleasant evening with a charming traveler who would be gone in a few days, leaving me with nothing but memories and the kind of what-if thoughts that could haunt a person for years. But even as I tried to rationalize my feelings, I couldn't shake the sense that something significant had happened, that my life had just taken a turn toward possibilities I had never dared to imagine for myself, possibilities that my family would probably dismiss as more evidence of my unrealistic expectations and fairy tale thinking. The next morning I called in sick to work something I never did, but I needed time to prepare for dinner time, to figure out what to wear, how to present myself to someone who seemed accustomed to a level of sophistication I wasn't sure I possessed. I spent hours going through my closet, rejecting everything as too casual, too formal, too ordinary for someone who lived in Monaco and traveled the world on diplomatic business. I finally settled on a simple black dress that I had bought for my college roommate's wedding 2 years earlier. Something classic enough to work in an upscale restaurant, but not so formal that I would look like I was trying too hard to impress him. Though of course I was trying to impress him, trying to be worthy of his attention, trying to be the kind of woman who belonged in the same room as someone like Alexander, even though I had no idea what kind of woman that might be. He picked me up exactly at 7, driving a car that was elegant without being flashy, expensive without being ostentatious, the kind of vehicle that whispered quality rather than shouting wealth. And when I slid into the passenger seat, I noticed that everything about his world seemed to operate on this principle of understated excellence, from the soft leather seats to the classical music playing quietly on the stereo, to the way he held doors and helped me with my coat. Like these gestures were as natural as breathing, rather than performances designed to impress. The restaurant he had chosen was tucked away in a quiet corner of the Upper East Side, the kind of place that didn't need to advertise, because anyone who mattered already knew about it. And as we were led to our table, I noticed the way the staff greeted Alexander with the kind of respectful familiarity that suggested this wasn't his first visit, despite the fact that he supposedly lived across an ocean. Dinner was a revelation, not just because the food was extraordinary, though it was the kind of meal that spoiled you for ordinary restaurants forever, but because Alexander revealed himself to be someone far more complex and interesting than I had imagined. During our first meeting, he spoke fluent French with the sommelier, discussed art history with the passion of someone who had grown up surrounded by masterpieces, told stories about traveling to places I had only seen in magazines. And through it all, he kept steering the conversation back to me, asking about my dreams, my fears, my thoughts on everything from literature to politics to the best way to spend a perfect day, making me feel like my opinions mattered, like my experiences were worth sharing, even though they seemed impossibly ordinary compared to his cosmopolitan lifestyle. It was during dessert, a perfect crème brûlée, that we shared with one spoon in a gesture that felt more intimate than it should have, that he finally began to reveal the truth about who he really was. "Andrea," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have mentioned last night, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding like I was bragging or trying to impress you with things that have nothing to do with who I am as a person." I waited, feeling my heart rate increase, because something in his expression told me that whatever he was about to say would change everything between us, would shift us from the realm of pleasant possibility into something far more complicated and potentially wonderful. "The truth is," he continued, "my full name is Prince Alexander Philippe Auguste of Monaco, and while that title comes with certain privileges and responsibilities, it also comes with complications that I'm not sure you're prepared to handle." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they were so far outside the realm of my experience that I couldn't immediately process them. Prince, not just some wealthy businessman from Monaco, not just someone with diplomatic connections, but an actual honest-to-God prince sitting across from me sharing crème brûlée and looking at me like I might run away screaming at any moment, which, to be honest, was not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Because how does a girl from Ohio who works as a marketing coordinator for a mid-level consulting firm end up having dinner with royalty? How does someone whose biggest claim to fame is organizing successful office parties suddenly find herself in a situation that belongs in movies or romance novels rather than real life? I stared at him for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds trying to reconcile this new information with the man I had been getting to know, trying to understand why someone with a title and presumably unlimited options had chosen to spend his time with me. "You're serious?" I finally managed to say. Because despite the evidence of the expensive car, the perfect restaurant, the way everyone seemed to treat him with subtle deference, I still couldn't quite believe that I was sitting across from actual royalty. That the man who had made me laugh until my sides hurt and who listened to my stories about growing up in small-town Ohio, like they were the most fascinating tales ever told, was someone who would someday help rule a country completely serious. He said, "And I understand if this changes things between us, if it makes you uncomfortable, or if you decide that dating someone with my particular complications isn't worth the hassle. Believe me, I understand that my life comes with challenges that most people aren't interested in dealing with. Photographers who follow me around protocol that governs everything from what I wear to who I'm seen, with family obligations that sometimes take precedence over personal desires. I've had relationships, and because women couldn't handle the scrutiny, or because they were more interested in my title than in me as a person. The vulnerability in his voice, the way he seemed genuinely worried that I might reject him because of who he was, rather than in spite of it, made something inside me soften and settle, because I realized that beneath the title and the privilege and the fairy tale lifestyle, he was still just a man who wanted to be loved for himself, rather than for what he represented, someone who had probably spent his entire life wondering whether people cared about Alexander the person or Prince Alexander, the symbol. And in that moment, I understood why he had introduced himself simply as Alexander, why he had waited until we had established a real connection before revealing the full truth about his identity. He wanted to know that I was interested in him before I knew about the crown and the palace and all the trappings that came with loving someone whose life would never be entirely his own. I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the same electric connection that had sparked between us the night before, but now amplified by the knowledge that this was real, that he was real, that somehow against all odds and logic I had stumbled into something that felt like destiny. "Alexander," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the fact that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. "I don't care if you're a prince or a pauper or anything in between. What I care about is the fact that you make me feel like I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be when I'm with you. What I care about is that you listen when I talk and you laugh at my terrible jokes and you look at me like I'm something precious, something worth your time and attention. I don't know anything about protocol or royal obligations or how to date someone who has paparazzi, but I know that I don't want this to end. I know that I want to see where this goes, even if it's complicated, even if it's scary, even if my family thinks I've completely lost my mind." His smile in response was like the sun coming out after weeks of rain, bright and warm and full of relief and joy, and something that looked suspiciously like love, though it seemed too soon to use that word, even in my own thoughts. "Thank you," he said, squeezing my hand gently. "Andrea, you have no idea how much it means to hear you say that, how terrifying it was to risk losing you by telling you the truth, but how impossible it would have been to continue without being honest about who I am and what being with me would mean for your life, because make no mistake, being with me will change everything for you. There will be security details and official events and photographers who want to know everything about your past. There will be protocol lessons and wardrobe consultations and people who will judge every word you say, every choice you make. There will be times when our relationship belongs as much to the public as it does to us, and I need you to understand all of that before we go any further." The gravity of what he was describing should have terrified me, should have sent me running back to my safe, ordinary life, where the biggest drama was whether to order Chinese food or pizza for dinner, but instead, I felt a strange sense of excitement, a feeling that I was finally stepping into the life I was meant to live, rather than the one I had settled for, because I didn't know anything better was possible. Yes, it would be complicated. Yes, it would require me to learn new skills and navigate unfamiliar territory. Yes, it would probably drive my family absolutely crazy when they found out. But it would also be an adventure, the kind of grand romantic adventure that I had secretly dreamed of my entire life, even when everyone around me insisted that such things only happened in movies and fairy tales. Here was my fairy tale sitting across from me in an elegant restaurant, asking if I was brave enough to say yes to the unknown, brave enough to trust that love could be bigger than fear, brave enough to believe that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones most worth pursuing. Over the next several weeks, Alexander courted me in the old-fashioned sense of the word, bringing me flowers every time we met, taking me to museums and concerts and quiet restaurants where we could talk for hours without interruption, showing me corners of New York that I had never explored. Despite living there for 5 years, he told me stories about his childhood growing up in a palace, but also growing up under constant scrutiny, never able to have a tantrum or make a mistake without it becoming a matter of public record. He talked about the loneliness of always being on display, the difficulty of forming genuine friendships when people always wanted something from you, The challenge of finding someone who could love you for yourself, rather than for the access you provided to a world of wealth and privilege. And through it all, he made me feel like I was the most interesting person he had ever met. Like my ordinary experiences were extraordinary, simply because they were mine. He flew back to Monaco twice during those weeks, always returning with small gifts that showed how much attention he paid to our conversations. A book by an author I had mentioned wanting to read, a piece of jewelry from a designer whose work I had admired in a magazine, a bottle of perfume that reminded him of the way I smelled when we danced in my tiny apartment to music playing from my phone, because I didn't own a proper stereo system. Each gift was thoughtful rather than expensive, personal rather than flashy chosen, because it would make me smile rather than because it would impress me. And I began to understand that this was how he showed love, through small gestures that proved he was listening, that he was thinking of me, even when we were apart, that he valued the connection we were building more than any grand romantic gesture could express. 3 weeks after that first dinner, he asked me to spend a weekend with him in the Hamptons, at a house that belonged to a family friend, a chance to get away from the city and spend uninterrupted time together without the distractions of work and social obligations and everyday life. I said yes without hesitation, because by then I was completely gone, completely fallen, completely willing to follow him wherever he wanted to take me. And that weekend was when everything changed, when our relationship shifted from possibility to certainty, when I realized that what I felt for him wasn't just infatuation or attraction, but something deeper and more permanent, something that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, something that felt like the beginning of the rest of my life. We spent Saturday morning walking on the beach, talking about everything and nothing, watching the waves crash against the shore, and feeling like we were the only two people in the world. And that afternoon, while we were sitting on the deck overlooking the ocean, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Alexander got down on one knee and pulled out a ring that took my breath away. Not because it was large, though it was not, because it was obviously expensive, though it certainly was, but because it was perfect for me. Classic and elegant and timeless, exactly what I would have chosen for myself if I had dared to dream that big Andrea Miranda. He said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, I know we haven't known each other long, and I know that asking you to marry me means asking you to completely change your life, to step into a world that will sometimes be overwhelming and always be public. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I don't want to spend another day wondering what our life together could be like. I want to build that life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to show you my country and introduce you to my family and figure out how to balance duty with desire, tradition with love. Will you marry me? Will you be my princess? Will you take this crazy leap with me and trust that we can figure out everything else as we go? The ring slid onto my finger like it had been made specifically for me, like my hand had been waiting my entire life to wear it. And as I looked down at the diamond, catching the last rays of sunlight, I realized that my parents had been wrong about everything. They had been wrong about my prospects, wrong about my worth, wrong about what I deserved and what I could achieve. They had told me I would never get married, that I was too old, too picky, too unrealistic in my expectations. And here, I was engaged to a prince sitting on a deck overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, wearing a ring that probably cost more than they made in a year, about to become part of one of the oldest royal families in Europe. It was poetic justice of the most satisfying kind. And yet, as I looked at Alexander waiting for my answer with hope and vulnerability written across his face, I realized that the sweetest part wasn't proving my family wrong. The sweetest part was proving myself right for believing that love could be bigger than their small vision for my life, for trusting that I deserved something extraordinary, for refusing to settle for Harold from church or anyone else who saw me as better than nothing rather than worth everything. Yes, I said the word coming out like a prayer, like a promise, like the beginning of a story I never could have written for myself but somehow was being invited to live, and as Alexander slipped the ring onto my finger and kissed me with the kind of passion that romance novels try to describe but never quite capture, I felt pieces of myself that I didn't even know were broken suddenly snap back into place. I felt the girl who had been told she was asking for too much finally exhale with relief, because she had found someone who thought she wasn't asking for nearly enough. And in that moment, with the ocean stretching endlessly before us and the man I loved holding me like I was the most precious thing in his world, I understood that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones that are simply waiting for us to be brave enough to believe we deserve them. 2 weeks after Alexander proposed, I was floating through life in a bubble of happiness that felt almost surreal, waking up each morning to the sight of my engagement ring, catching the sunlight streaming through my apartment windows, spending my days planning a future that seemed too wonderful to be real, and my evenings on video calls with my fiancé who was back in Monaco handling royal duties and preparing for our official engagement announcement, which would happen once I flew over to meet his family, and we figured out how to navigate the media storm that would inevitably follow. But while I was living in this perfect romantic bubble, my family was apparently experiencing their own dramatic upheaval, though I wouldn't learn about it until much later when desperation finally loosened their tongues, and pride gave way to panic in ways that would have been unthinkable just months before. It started with my father's business, the small accounting firm he had built over 30 years of careful conservative growth, suddenly finding itself in the crosshairs of an IRS investigation that began as routine audit but quickly escalated into something far more serious when discrepancies were discovered in several major client accounts, discrepancies that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud. And while Dad maintained his innocence, claimed he had been set up by a disgruntled former employee who had access to the files, the investigation was moving forward with the kind of methodical thoroughness that spelled disaster for a man whose entire identity was built around being respectable, responsible, and above reproach. In all matters, financial and personal, the legal fees alone were enough to drain their savings. But the real devastation came when longtime clients began pulling their accounts afraid of being associated with a firm under federal investigation. Meanwhile, Mom was dealing with her own crisis at the elementary school where she had taught 4th grade for 22 years, suddenly finding herself on administrative leave, pending an investigation into allegations that she had been showing favoritism to certain students while discriminating against others based on their family backgrounds. Allegations that were probably rooted in her unfortunate tendency to make comments about children whose parents didn't meet her standards of respectability, but which in the current climate of heightened sensitivity around educational equity had taken on a much more serious tone than anyone could have anticipated. The school board was under pressure from several parents who had been documenting incidents for months, building a case that painted Mom as someone who created hostile learning environments for children she deemed unworthy of her time and attention, and while she insisted that she was simply trying to maintain standards, the evidence suggested a pattern of behavior that was both unprofessional and potentially discriminatory. Jessica, my perfect sister with her perfect marriage and perfect children, was discovering that perfection was more fragile than she had realized when her husband Mark was suddenly laid off from his executive position at a tech company that was downsizing in response to market pressures, leaving them with a mortgage they couldn't afford on a house they had bought at the peak of the market car payments for 2 luxury vehicles that were now worth less than they owed, and credit card bills that had accumulated during years of living beyond their means because they assumed Mark's income would continue to grow indefinitely. The unemployment benefits barely covered their basic expenses, and Mark's job search was proving more difficult than expected because his specialized skills were in less demand than they had been when the economy was booming and companies were throwing money at anyone with the right credentials and connections. But the real catastrophe, the one that would ultimately force them to swallow their pride and reach out to the daughter they had dismissed as a failure, was still coming in the form of a phone call that would arrive on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks After my engagement, while I was sitting in a coffee shop in Manhattan reviewing wedding venue options that Alexander's assistant had compiled for me, venues in locations I had never dreamed of visiting, let alone celebrating the most important day of my life. The call came from my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who had always been the family member most likely to tell uncomfortable truths, the one who didn't sugarcoat bad news or pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The one who had watched my parents tear me down at that dinner and had wanted to say something but held her tongue because she knew it wouldn't change anything and might make things worse for everyone involved. "Andrea, honey," she said, and I could hear the strain in her voice, the careful way she was choosing her words, like she was walking through a minefield. "I hate to be the one to tell you this, but there are some things happening with your parents that I think you should know about, things that they would probably never tell you themselves, because they're too proud and too stubborn to admit that they might have been wrong about some of the choices they've made over the years." I set down my coffee and moved to a quieter corner of the cafe because something in her tone told me that this conversation was going to require my full attention, that whatever she was about to say would change my understanding of my family's situation in ways that might be uncomfortable, but were probably necessary. What kind of things, I asked, though part of me already suspected that this call was connected to the strange voicemails I had been receiving from blocked numbers, voicemails that I had been deleting without listening to because I assumed they were either spam or attempts by my family to continue the conversation that had ended so badly at that dinner. "Well," she said, taking a deep breath, "your father's business is in serious trouble. Andrea, not just financial trouble, but legal trouble. The kind that could result in criminal charges if they can't prove that he wasn't involved in some kind of fraud, scheme, and your mother has been suspended from her teaching job, pending an investigation into her treatment of students, and Jessica and Mark are facing foreclosure on their house because they can't make the mortgage payments since he lost his job, and the whole family is basically falling apart at the seams while trying to pretend that everything is fine, that they can handle all of this on their own without help from anyone. Especially not from you, because admitting they need help would mean admitting that they might have been wrong about some things, and you know how your parents feel about admitting they were wrong about anything." The information hit me like a series of small explosions, each revelation adding another layer to a picture of familial crisis that I couldn't have imagined just weeks before when they had been so confident in their assessment of my failures, so certain that they were the successful ones, and I was the one who would eventually come crawling back for help and support. I felt a complex mix of emotions, sympathy for what they were going through, anger at the way they had treated me, vindication that their judgment might not have been as sound as they believed, and confusion about what, if anything, I was supposed to do with this information, given that they had made it clear they didn't want me in their lives unless I was willing to accept their version of who I should be and what my life should look like. "How bad is it?" I asked. Because despite everything, despite the harsh words and the dismissive attitudes and the way they had made me feel small and worthless, I still cared about them, still felt some sense of family obligation, even if I wasn't sure what that obligation required of me in this situation. Carol sighed heavily, and I could picture her sitting in her kitchen with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug the way she always did when she was delivering difficult news. "It's bad. Andrea, really bad. Your father could lose his license, could face jail time. If this investigation goes the wrong way, and even if he's cleared the damage to his reputation, means the business is probably finished after 30 years of building it up. Client by client, your mother might lose her pension if she's terminated for cause instead of just retiring early, and Jessica and Mark are looking at bankruptcy if they can't figure out a way to keep the house, and Mark can't find another job soon enough to matter, and through all of this, they keep talking about how they don't need anyone's help, how they're going to figure it out on their own, how they would rather lose everything than ask for charity from people who don't understand their situation. But, Andrea, honey, I think they're scared, really. Scared in a way I've never seen before, and I think they're starting to realize that some of the things they said to you, some of the assumptions they made might not have been fair or accurate. The word scared stayed with me long after I hung up the phone, because I had never thought of my parents as people who could be scared. They had always seemed so certain, so confident in their judgments, so sure that they understood how the world worked and what constituted success and failure. So convinced that their way of living was the right way, and anyone who deviated from their path was making a mistake that would eventually lead to regret and disappointment. But now they were facing the possibility that their own choices, their own assumptions about financial security and social respectability might have been flawed, that the life they had built so carefully might not be as solid as they had believed, and that realization must have been terrifying for people who had never had to question their fundamental beliefs about how to live safely and successfully in an unpredictable world. I spent the rest of that day walking through Central Park trying to process this new information, trying to figure out how I felt about my family's crisis and what, if anything, I should do about it. On one hand, they had been cruel to me, had dismissed my dreams and ambitions, had made me feel like I was fundamentally flawed for wanting something different from what they had achieved. They had told me I would never find love, never get married, never amount to anything more than a disappointment, who would eventually come crawling back to them for help and support when my unrealistic expectations inevitably led to failure and loneliness. On the other hand, they were still my family, still the people who had raised me, who had been present for birthdays and graduations and all the small moments that make up a childhood, even if they hadn't understood or supported my adult choices. And watching them suffer even from a distance felt more complicated than I had expected it to feel. That evening, I called Emma, needing to talk through my conflicted feelings with someone who knew my history with my family, but could also provide some objective perspective on a situation that felt too emotionally charged for me to navigate alone. Emma listened without interrupting as I explained about the phone call from Carol, the various crises affecting different family members, and my uncertainty about whether I had any obligation to help people who had made it clear they didn't want my help, unless it came with complete surrender to their vision of who I should be and what my life should look like when I finished. She was quiet for a long moment before asking the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Andrea," she said gently, "what would you do if these were strangers? If you heard about a family going through this kind of crisis but you had no personal connection to them, no history of hurt or disappointment? How would you respond then?" The question forced me to separate my emotional reaction from my moral instincts, and I realized that if these were strangers, I would feel sympathy for their situation, but I wouldn't feel personally responsible for fixing it. I would hope that they had resources and support systems to help them through their difficulties, but I wouldn't assume that their problems were mine to solve. And that realization helped me understand that just because someone shares your DNA doesn't mean their emergencies automatically become your emergencies, especially when they have made it clear that they don't respect your choices or value your perspective. But at the same time, I couldn't entirely shake the feeling that there was something cold about turning my back on family members in crisis, even family members who had turned their backs on me when I needed their support and understanding. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about my family's situation at odd moments, wondering how Dad was handling the stress of the investigation, whether Mom was sleeping at night or lying awake, worried about losing the career that had defined her identity for decades, whether Jessica was putting on a brave face for her children while privately panicking about the possibility of losing their home. I tried to focus on my wedding planning, on my upcoming trip to Monaco to meet Alexander's family, on the excitement of starting a new chapter of my life. But the knowledge of their crisis created a background noise of anxiety that I couldn't quite silence, even though I told myself repeatedly that their problems were not my responsibility, that I had my own life to live and my own future to focus on. The first direct contact came exactly 1 week after Carol's phone call in the form of a text message from Jessica sent from a number I didn't recognize, which meant she had probably gotten a new phone or was borrowing someone else's because their phone service had been disconnected for non-payment. The message was brief and carefully worded, designed to convey urgency without admitting fault or acknowledging the way our last conversation had ended. "Andrea, it's Jessica. I know we haven't talked, In a while. But some things have come up, and I was wondering if we could meet for coffee, just to catch up. Nothing dramatic. Just sisters talking. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you'll consider meeting with me soon. She had included a phone number and asked me to text back if I was interested in getting together. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to decode the subtext, trying to understand what just sisters talking really meant, and whether some things have come up was a euphemism for the family crisis that Carol had described or something. Else entirely part of me wanted to ignore the message to maintain the boundaries I had established after that awful dinner, to protect the happiness and peace I had found with Alexander from the toxicity that seemed to follow every interaction with my family. But another part of me was curious about what Jessica wanted, whether she was reaching out as a genuine attempt at reconciliation, or because she needed something from me, something that might be related to their financial difficulties and their growing desperation as their various crises continued to escalate without resolution. After discussing it with Alexander during one of our evening phone calls, I decided to respond to Jessica's text, but on my terms in a public place for a limited amount of time, with clear boundaries about what I was and wasn't willing to discuss. I suggested we meet at a coffee shop in Midtown, a neutral location that wouldn't trigger memories of family gatherings or childhood conflicts, and I made it clear that I could only spare an hour because I had other commitments, which was true since. I was meeting with a wedding planner later that afternoon to discuss flowers and music and all the details that go into planning a celebration that would eventually be attended by heads of state and covered by international media. Though, of course, Jessica had no idea about any of that. She agreed immediately to my terms, which should have been my first clue that this meeting was more important to her than she was letting on, because the Jessica I knew would have pushed back, would have suggested meeting at her house or a restaurant. Closer to where she lived, would have asked for more time and complained about my availability. But instead, she accepted my conditions without argument and confirmed that she would be there. At the time I suggested, which meant either she had changed significantly since our last conversation, or she was desperate enough to swallow her pride and meet me on my terms, rather than risk me changing my mind about seeing her at all. The coffee shop was crowded when I arrived, which I had chosen deliberately because I wanted witnesses. I wanted the security of being in a public place where emotional manipulation would be harder, and dramatic scenes would be discouraged by social pressure. Jessica was already there, sitting at a small table near the window, looking older than I remembered and more tired than I had ever seen her. She was wearing clothes that I recognized from years past, outfits that had once been her favorites, but now looked worn and dated, like she hadn't been shopping for new things in a while, and her hair, which had always been perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail that suggested she either didn't have time or money for her usual salon. Appointments, when she saw me approaching, she stood up with a smile that seemed genuine but nervous, like she wasn't sure how I was going to react to seeing her. "Andrea," she said, reaching out to hug me. "Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. I know things were tense the last time we talked, and I wasn't sure you would want to see me, but I'm really glad you're here." I hugged her back briefly, noting that she felt thinner than before, more fragile somehow. And when we sat down, I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Nervousness, or stress, or both, I couldn't tell. But something had clearly changed since. That confident, dismissive woman who had lectured me about lowering my standards and accepting reality had been replaced by someone who seemed uncertain, vulnerable in a way that made me feel simultaneously sympathetic and wary, because I couldn't forget how cruel she had been during our last conversation, how readily she had joined Mom and Dad in tearing down my dreams and dismissing my worth. We spent the first few minutes on safe topics: her kids, my job, the weather in New York versus Ohio, all the polite small talk that people use to avoid addressing the real reason they're sitting across from each other in a coffee shop. But eventually, the conversation turned more serious, and Jessica's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "Andrea," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, I need to tell you some things that are happening with the family, things that Mom and Dad would probably kill me for sharing with you, but things that I think you should know, because you're still part of this family, even if we haven't done a great job of showing that lately. And because honestly, I don't know who else to talk to about all of this, and I'm scared, really scared about what's going to happen to all of us if we can't figure out a way to get through this mess we've found ourselves in. She proceeded to tell me everything about Dad's legal troubles, Mom's suspension from teaching, Mark's unemployment, their financial difficulties, the possibility of losing their house, all the details that Carol had already shared, but from the perspective of someone who was living through it rather than observing from a distance. And as she talked, I could see the fear in her eyes, the genuine terror of someone who had always felt secure and stable, suddenly finding herself in free fall without a safety net. She talked about lying awake at night, worrying about how to explain to her children why they might have to move, why Grandpa might go to jail, why their comfortable, predictable world was suddenly falling apart around them and through it all. She kept apologizing, not for the specific things she had said to me, but for the general situation, for having to burden me with family problems, for not being a better sister, for letting things get so bad before reaching out. When she finished talking, we sat in silence for several minutes while I processed everything she had told me, trying to separate my emotional reaction from my practical assessment of their situation, trying to figure out what she wanted from me, and what I was willing to give. The silence stretched between us, uncomfortable, but necessary. Because I could tell she was waiting for me to respond, waiting for me to offer help or advice, or at least reassurance that everything would work out okay. But I wasn't ready to provide any of those things because I still didn't trust her motives, still wasn't sure whether this conversation was genuine sisterly concern or a carefully orchestrated attempt to manipulate me into providing financial assistance that they were too proud to ask for directly. Finally, I spoke. Choosing my words carefully, "Jessica," I said, "I appreciate you telling me what's going on, and I can see that you're scared and stressed about everything that's happening, but I have to ask, why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" Her face flushed red, and she looked down at her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, like she was ashamed of whatever she was about to say. "Andrea, I know this is going to sound awful, and I know you have every right to tell me to go to hell after the way we treated you, but I was hoping maybe you could help us somehow. I don't mean financially necessarily, though, if you had any connections or resources that might be useful, but more like advice or support, or just being there for us during this difficult time. I know we haven't earned the right to ask anything of you. I know we were terrible to you at dinner that night, and I'm sorry about that. Really sorry. But you're the only one in the family who seems to have her life together, who seems capable of handling crisis and making smart decisions, and I don't know who else to turn to for help with this situation." The request was carefully worded, designed to sound like she was asking for emotional support rather than money, but I could read between the lines, could see that she was hoping I might have resources or connections that could somehow help their various crises, and I realized that, despite everything, despite their dismissal of my career and my choices, they had somehow concluded that I was successful enough to be worth approaching for help, which was ironic, given that they had no idea just how successful I actually was, or how dramatically my circumstances had changed since that awful dinner. But their assumption that I might be able to help them suggested that they had been paying more attention to my life than they had admitted, that perhaps their dismissive attitude had been partly defensive, partly rooted in their own insecurities about their choices and achievements. "Jessica," I said carefully, "I understand that you're going through a difficult time, and I'm sorry that the family is dealing with so many problems at once, but I have to be honest with you. I'm not sure what kind of help you think I can provide, and I'm not sure that me getting involved would be helpful for anyone. Given the way our relationships have been strained lately, maybe it would be better for everyone if you focused on the resources and support systems that are actually available to you, rather than trying to drag me back into family drama that I've been trying to distance myself from." She looked stricken by my response, like she had been hoping for something different, but also like she had expected rejection and had prepared herself for disappointment. "Please, Andrea," she said, and now the desperation was clear in her voice, the careful composure completely abandoned. "I know we don't deserve your help. I know we were awful to you, but we're drowning here, and I don't know what else to do. Dad might go to prison. Mom might lose everything she's worked for her whole career. Mark can't find a job, and we're going to lose our house. And I can't bear the thought of having to tell my kids that their whole world is falling apart because the adults, in their lives, made terrible decisions and can't figure out how to fix them. I'm not asking you to solve our problems. I'm just asking you to care enough to try to help us figure out what to do next. Because honestly, Andrea, you're the smartest person. I know, and you always seem to land on your feet no matter what happened, and maybe you could help us figure out how to do the same thing." The compliment was clearly intended to flatter me into helping, but it also revealed something interesting about how Jessica saw me. Despite all the criticism and dismissal, she apparently thought I was smart and capable and good at handling difficult situations, which made me wonder why she had been so willing to join Mom and Dad in tearing me down if she actually respected my judgment and abilities. But more importantly, it made me realize that she had no idea about the real changes in my life, had no clue that the woman she was asking for help was engaged to a prince and living a life that would soon make their current crisis seem small and manageable by comparison. And I found myself wondering what would happen if I told her the truth. About Alexander, about the engagement, about the fact that I could probably solve all their financial problems with a single phone call to my future husband's financial advisors. But I wasn't ready to reveal that information, wasn't ready to deal with the complications that would follow. Wasn't sure whether sharing the truth about my engagement would help the situation or make it infinitely more complex. So instead, I told Jessica that I would think about what she had said, that I would consider whether there was any way I could be helpful without making promises I wasn't sure I could keep, and I suggested that we end our coffee meeting before it became too emotional or complicated for either of us to handle. She seemed disappointed by my non-committal response, but also relieved that I hadn't rejected her outright, that I hadn't told her to never contact me again, or accused her of only reaching out because she needed something from me. And as we parted ways with an awkward hug and promises to stay in touch, I couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation had changed something between us, had shifted the dynamic in ways that would have consequences I couldn't yet predict. That night, I lay awake thinking about Jessica's desperation, about the fear I had seen in her eyes, about the way she had described lying awake, worrying about her children, and how to protect them from the consequences of adult failures. And despite my anger about how my family had treated me, despite my determination to maintain boundaries and protect my own happiness, I found myself feeling genuinely sorry for what they were going through, genuinely concerned about the impact their crisis would have on innocent children who had done nothing to deserve having their security and stability destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. And I began to wonder whether there might be a way to help them without compromising my own well-being, without allowing myself to be drawn back into toxic family dynamics that had taken me years to escape. The answer came to me 3 days later during a conversation with Alexander about family obligations and the responsibilities that come with privilege and power. He was telling me about a charity foundation that his family supported that provided emergency assistance to families in crisis. And as he described their work, I realized that there might be a way to help my family without personally involving myself in their drama, without opening myself up to manipulation or emotional abuse. I could arrange for them to receive help through intermediaries, could ensure that their immediate financial needs were met without them ever knowing that the assistance came from me, and more importantly, without me having to engage directly with their crisis or their expectations about what my help should look like. The more I thought about this solution, the more it appealed to me, because it would allow me to act on my better impulses to help family members in genuine need, without sacrificing the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. It would demonstrate that I was capable of compassion and generosity without requiring me to accept responsibility for their problems or to pretend that their previous treatment of me had been acceptable, and it would give me the satisfaction of knowing that I had risen above their pettiness and cruelty, to help them in their time of need, even though they had refused to support me when I was struggling to find my own path in life, and it would prove to myself that I was the kind of person who could choose kindness even when kindness hadn't been shown to me. But before I could implement this plan, before I could arrange for anonymous assistance to reach my struggling family members, I received a phone call that changed everything, that forced me to confront the full extent of their desperation and the lengths they were willing to go to in order to secure my help. The call came from my mother at 11:30 on a Thursday night, her voice shaking with emotion as she delivered news that made Jessica's coffee shop confession seem like a minor inconvenience by comparison, and I realized that their crisis had just escalated beyond anything I could have imagined, beyond anything that anonymous charity could address, beyond anything that could be solved without direct personal involvement. And difficult conversations about forgiveness, accountability, and what it really means to be family when everything else falls apart. Andrea, please don't hang up. I know it's late, but I didn't know who else to call, and I've been sitting here for hours trying to work up the courage to dial your number because I know you probably don't want to hear from me after everything that happened at dinner that night. But something terrible has occurred, and I need you to know about it, even if you decide you can't help us. Even if you decide we don't deserve your help after the way we treated you. My mother's voice was barely recognizable, raw with emotion and exhaustion, in a way I had never heard before, and despite my resolve to maintain boundaries, despite my determination not to get pulled back into family drama, I found myself gripping the phone tighter and asking what had happened. What could possibly be so urgent that she would call me at nearly midnight when we hadn't spoken since I walked out of their house months ago? Your father, she said, and I could hear her crying now. Quiet sobs that she was trying to suppress had a heart attack this afternoon, a massive one, and he's in intensive care, and the doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it through the night. And I know we have no right to ask anything of you after what we said. After how we dismissed you. But Andrea, he keeps asking for you. Even though he's barely conscious, he keeps saying your name. And I think he knows. He might not have another chance to talk to you, to tell you things he should have said years ago, and I'm begging you. Please, if there's any part of you that still cares about him at all, please consider coming home just for a few hours, just to see him one last time. Because I don't think either of us could live with ourselves if he died without getting the chance to apologize to you. The words hit me like physical blows, each piece of information adding another layer to a situation that had just become infinitely more complex than family financial troubles or career difficulties. This was life and death. This was the possibility of permanent endings and irreversible regrets. This was the kind of moment that reshapes everything that came before and everything that comes after. And despite my anger, despite my hurt, despite my determination to protect myself from their toxicity, I felt something inside me crack open at the thought of my father dying while we were estranged, while harsh words were the last things we had exchanged, while he carried whatever regrets or apologies he might want to share into whatever comes after this life without ever having the chance to voice them. Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What hospital is he at? What do the doctors say about his condition? What exactly happened? And as she gave me the details, told me about how he had collapsed in his office while meeting with his lawyer about the federal investigation, told me about the ambulance ride and the emergency surgery and the machines that were keeping him alive. I found myself already mentally calculating how quickly I could get to Ohio, how I could rearrange my schedule to be there while still maintaining the secret of my engagement, while still protecting the new life I had built from the chaos and pain of my old one. It felt like trying to live in two different worlds simultaneously, trying to be Andrea the successful New Yorker engaged to a prince while also being Andrea the daughter whose father might be dying in a hospital bed, asking for forgiveness she might not be ready to give. I'll be there tomorrow. I heard myself saying the words before I had fully decided to say them, but knowing even as they left my mouth that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't go. If I let pride or hurt or self-protection keep me away when my father might be dying. I'll drive down in the morning and I'll come to the hospital. But Mom, I need you to understand that I'm coming because he's my father, and because I don't want him to die with things unsaid between us. But I'm not coming back into the family. I'm not pretending that everything is fine, just because there's a medical emergency. And I'm not going to be manipulated into fixing everyone's problems, just because you're scared and desperate. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you accept those conditions, or would you rather I stay away? Yes, she said immediately. Yes, of course I understand, and I'm grateful, Andrea. So grateful that you're willing to come at all after everything we put you through, and I promise I won't try to pressure you about anything else. I won't ask you to get involved in our other problems. I just want you to have the chance to see your father and maybe find some peace with him before it's too late. Because whatever else has happened between us, he loves you. Andrea, he's always loved you, even when he didn't know how to show it. Even when he said things he didn't mean because he was scared or frustrated or disappointed in ways that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with his own limitations, his own fears about what it means to be a good father to a daughter he didn't always understand. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that felt impossible to navigate without compromising either my emotional well-being or my moral obligations. As a daughter, I called Alexander, even though it was early morning in Monaco, and I knew he would be preparing for official duties, told him about the phone call, about my father's condition, about my decision to go home for what might be the last time. And he listened without judgment, offered to fly to New York immediately to be with me during this difficult time. But I declined because I wasn't ready to introduce him to my family. Under these circumstances, wasn't ready to deal with their reaction to learning about my engagement while my father was fighting for his life in intensive care. The drive to Ohio felt endless, even though it only took 6 hours every mile, bringing me closer to a confrontation I had been avoiding for months, closer to people who had hurt me deeply, but who were also facing losses that put our previous conflicts into a different perspective. I spent the time listening to music that reminded me of happier times with my family, thinking about my father, not as the man who had dismissed my dreams and told me I was pricing myself out of the marriage market, but as the man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with math homework and stayed up all night when I had pneumonia in 7th grade, making sure I was breathing properly and comfortable enough to sleep, because beneath all the criticism and disappointment, he was still the person who had shaped my earliest understanding of what it meant to be protected and cared for by someone who loved you. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, which made sense since visiting hours were almost over. But Mom had arranged for me to be allowed in to see Dad despite the time restrictions, and as I walked through the sterile corridors, following signs to the cardiac intensive care unit, I felt my anxiety ratcheting up with each step because I had no idea what I would find when I reached his room. No idea what condition he would be in or whether he would even be conscious enough to recognize me or understand that I had come in response to his request for my presence. And I realized that despite everything, despite all my anger and hurt, I was terrified of losing him before we could find some kind of resolution to the pain that had grown between us. Mom was waiting outside his room, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her, wearing clothes that looked like she had been sleeping in them, her hair unwashed and her face drawn with exhaustion and fear when she saw me approaching. She stood up quickly, and for a moment I thought she might try to hug me. But something in my posture must have communicated that I wasn't ready for physical affection, because she stopped herself and simply said, "Thank you for coming. Andrea. Thank you for being here, even after everything. I know this can't be easy for you, but it means everything to me. And I think it will mean everything to him, too, if he's able to understand that you're here, that you cared enough to come, despite how we treated you." "How is he?" I asked because I needed to know what to expect before I walked into that room, needed to prepare myself for whatever version of my father I was about to encounter. "He's stable," she said, "but very weak. The heart attack was severe, and there was some damage. They're not sure yet how much or what the long-term implications will be, But he's been in and out of consciousness, and every time he wakes up, you asks if anyone has called you if you're coming. And I keep telling him, yes, that you'll be here soon because I was praying that you would come, even though I know we don't deserve your forgiveness or your presence after the terrible things we said to you that night. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door to his room, and the sight that greeted me was both shocking and heartbreaking. My father, who had always seemed so strong, so certain, so immovable in his opinions, was lying in a hospital bed connected to machines that monitored his heart rate and breathing, surrounded by the beeping and humming of medical equipment that was keeping him alive. And he looked older than I remembered, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. His hair completely gray, now his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and labored even with the assistance of oxygen. And when I approached his bed and said, "Dad," softly, his eyes fluttered open and focused on me with an expression of relief and love that made my chest tight with emotion. "Andrea," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You came? I wasn't sure you would after what I said to you, after how cruel I was, but I'm so glad you're here, because I need to tell you things I should have said years ago. Things I was too proud or too stupid or too afraid to say before now, and I know I might not get another chance. So please let me talk. Let me try to explain why I said those terrible things and why I was so wrong about everything, so wrong about you and what you were capable of achieving in your life, because seeing you now, seeing the woman you've become, I realized that I never really knew you at all, never really understood what you needed from me as your father." I pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down, taking his hand in mine, because despite everything, despite all the hurt and anger I still loved, this man still wanted him to know that I was here, that he didn't have to face whatever was coming alone. "Dad, you don't have to explain anything right now. You need to focus on getting better, on healing from this heart attack. And then maybe when you're stronger, we can talk about the past and figure out how to move forward. But right now, I just want you to know that I'm here and that I love you. Even though we've had our differences, even though we said things to each other that were hurtful and hard to forget." But he shook his head weakly and tightened his grip on my hand with what little strength he had. "No, Andrea, I need to say this now because I might not get another chance. And I've been lying here thinking about all the ways I failed you as a father, all the times I should have supported your dreams instead of dismissing them, all the moments when I should have told you how proud I was of your independence and your courage, instead of trying to make you fit into some narrow idea of what a daughter should be. And I realize now that I was scared. Scared that you were going to leave us. Behind scared that you were going to build a life so different from ours that there wouldn't be room for us in it. And instead of supporting you and trusting that love would keep us connected, I tried to tear you down, tried to make you doubt yourself, so you would stay small and safe and close to home where I could understand you and control you and protect you from disappointments I was sure were coming." His words came out in fragments interrupted by his labored breathing and the need to rest between thoughts. But I could see how important it was to him to get these ideas out, to share the insights that his brush with mortality had given him about our relationship and his role in damaging it. And despite my resolve to maintain emotional distance, I found myself crying as I listened to him acknowledge mistakes I had never expected him to admit, recognize pain I had carried for years without believing he even understood that he had caused it. "You were always so smart," he continued, "so creative, so determined to make your own way in the world. And instead of celebrating those qualities, I saw them as threats to my authority, as challenges to my understanding of how life should work. And I'm sorry, Andrea, so sorry for making you feel like you had to choose between being yourself and being loved by your family, because that should never have been a choice you had to make." We talked for another hour, with him sharing memories of my childhood moments when he had felt proud of me, but had been too uncomfortable with emotion to express those feelings, and me finally able to tell him how his criticism had affected me, how his dismissal of my dreams had made me question my own worth and judgment, and by the time visiting hours ended, we had reached a kind of peace. Not a complete resolution of all our issues, but an understanding that we loved each other despite our differences. And that love was more important than being right about the choices each of us had made in trying to build meaningful lives. And when I kissed his forehead and promised to come back the next day, he smiled with more warmth than I had seen from him in years and whispered that he was proud of me, that he had always been proud of me even when he was too stubborn to say so. The next few days fell into a routine of hospital visits and careful conversations with Mom and Jessica, who were both clearly hoping that my presence during this crisis meant I was ready to rejoin the family fold, to put aside our previous conflicts, and resume the relationships that had been damaged by months of silence and hurt feelings. But I made it clear that while I was willing to be present during Dad's recovery, I wasn't ready to pretend that nothing had changed. Between us wasn't prepared to go back to accepting criticism and judgment about my life choices. Just because we were all scared about his health and uncertain about the future. And they seemed to understand, or at least accept my boundaries, even if they were disappointed, that my return wasn't permanent or unconditional. On the third day, Jessica approached me in the hospital cafeteria, where I was having lunch between visits, and asked if we could talk privately about something important, something that went beyond Dad's health, but was related to the family crisis they were all facing. And I agreed reluctantly, because I suspected this conversation would involve requests for help that I wasn't sure I was ready to provide. But I also knew that avoiding difficult discussions wouldn't make the underlying problems disappear, and might actually make them worse if desperation led to more dramatic attempts to involve me in their financial and legal troubles, and I wanted to maintain some control over how and when those topics were addressed. "Andrea," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I know you said you didn't want to get involved in our other problems, and I respect that, I really do, but I'm worried about what's going to happen to Mom and Dad if we can't find a way to help them with their legal and financial issues, because even if Dad recovers completely from this heart attack, he's still facing possible criminal charges, and Mom is still suspended from her job, and they're both too old and too proud to start over somewhere else to rebuild their lives from scratch if everything they've worked for gets taken away from them. And I keep thinking that maybe there's something we could do as a family to help them through this crisis, some way to pool our resources or connections or ideas to find solutions that none of us could manage alone." I studied her face, trying to determine whether this was genuine sisterly concern or another attempt to manipulate me into providing financial assistance. And I realized that it was probably both, that she was genuinely worried about our parents, but also hoping that my apparent success and stability meant I had resources that could make a difference in their increasingly desperate situation. And I found myself in the strange position of knowing that I could easily solve all their problems with a single phone call to Alexander's financial advisors, but not being ready to reveal that information, because I wasn't sure how they would handle learning about my engagement, especially under these emotionally charged circumstances when their judgment might be clouded by relief and gratitude rather than genuine acceptance of my choices. "Jessica," I said carefully, "I understand that you're worried about Mom and Dad, and I appreciate that you want to find solutions to their problems. But I think you're overestimating my ability to help them. My job pays well enough for me to live comfortably in New York, but I don't have the kind of resources that would make a significant difference in federal legal proceedings or major financial crises. And even if I did, I'm not sure that family members bailing each other out is always the best solution. Sometimes people need to face the consequences of their choices and figure out how to rebuild from whatever foundation remains after the crisis passes. And that might be painful, but it might also be more sustainable in the long run than depending on rescue from relatives." "But what if there was a way," she said, leaning forward with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "What if you had connections or opportunities that you haven't told us about? What if there were options we haven't explored yet because we've been too focused on traditional solutions? Bank loans, government programs, legal defense strategies. That might not be the right approach for our particular situation. I mean, you live in New York. You work with successful people. You must know individuals who have dealt with similar problems or who have resources that could help us navigate this crisis more effectively than we've been able to do on our own. And I'm not asking you to solve everything. I'm just asking you to think about whether there might be possibilities you haven't mentioned yet." Her words made it clear that she suspected I was hiding something that she believed I had access to, help I wasn't admitting. And I realized that my careful maintenance of boundaries was starting to look suspicious, that my refusal to provide specific details about my financial situation or professional connections was leading her to conclude that I was being deliberately secretive about resources that could save their family from disaster. And I found myself caught between wanting to maintain my privacy and wanting to end their speculation about what I might be able to do for them, and I wondered if this was the moment to tell them the truth about Alexander, about the engagement, about the fact that their assumptions about my capabilities were both completely wrong and completely accurate in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Before I could decide how to respond to Jessica's probing questions, my phone rang, and I saw Alexander's name on the caller ID, which meant it was evening in Monaco, and he was probably calling to check on how I was handling the family crisis and to offer whatever support I might need during this difficult time. But taking his call in front of Jessica would mean explaining who he was and why a man with a European accent was calling me during what was supposed to be a focused visit home to deal with family medical emergencies, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. So I declined the call and told Jessica that we should probably get back to Dad's room because visiting hours would be ending soon. That evening, back at the hotel where I was staying to avoid the complications of sleeping in my childhood bedroom while maintaining emotional boundaries with my family, I called Alexander back and told him about the increasingly awkward conversations with Jessica about her obvious suspicions that I was withholding information about my ability to help with their crises, and my growing sense that I was going to have to make a decision soon about whether to reveal our engagement or continue pretending that I was just a moderately successful single woman with limited resources and connections, and he listened thoughtfully before suggesting that perhaps it was time to trust my family with the truth, not because they deserved it after their treatment of me, but because living a double life was clearly becoming unsustainable and might actually be causing more problems than it solved. The decision became unavoidable the next morning, when I arrived at the hospital to find Mom pacing in the waiting area outside Dad's room, with an expression of panic that made my stomach clench with anxiety. She looked up when she saw me approaching, and I could see that she had been crying that whatever news she was about to share was going to change everything again, was going to add another layer of crisis to an already impossible situation, and I braced myself for whatever revelation was coming, wondering how much more drama and chaos one family could possibly endure before something had to give, before someone had to make difficult choices about what really mattered and what could be sacrificed in service of survival. Andrea, the reporters are here, Mom said, her voice shaking with a combination of terror and confusion. They're in the parking lot asking questions about you about some engagement announcement. They say you're marrying a prince and I don't understand what's happening, but they want to interview the family, and I told them there must be some mistake that my daughter isn't engaged to anyone, let alone royalty. But they have photographs. Andrea. Photographs of you with some man at fancy restaurants. And they're saying, his name is Prince Alexander, and I need you to tell me what's going on. Because I'm scared and confused, and I don't know what to say to these people who are treating our family like we're suddenly important when yesterday we were just ordinary people dealing with ordinary problems. The words hit me like a physical blow, because I realized that my carefully constructed double life had just collapsed in the most public way possible, that somehow the media had discovered my relationship with Alexander and had traced me to this small Ohio hospital where I was trying to navigate family reconciliation while my father recovered from a heart attack. And now everything I had been trying to protect was exposed not just to my family, but to the world, and I would have to deal with the consequences of months of secrecy while managing a medical crisis and family expectations that had just shifted from dismissive to desperately interested in ways that made me feel sick to my stomach. Mom? I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the chaos erupting around us. We need to go somewhere private where we can talk without being overheard by hospital staff or other patients, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything. You think you know about my life, and I need you to listen carefully and try not to interrupt until I've explained the whole situation, because it's complicated and I know it's going to be hard to believe. But everything those reporters are saying is true. And I'm sorry you had to find out this way instead of hearing it from me when I was ready to share it with you. She stared at me like I had just told her I was from another planet. And then without saying anything, she turned and walked toward a small family conference room that was used for private conversations between doctors and relatives, and I followed. Her knowing that the next few minutes would determine the future of my relationship with my family, would establish whether my engagement to Alexander would bring us closer together or drive us further apart. And I realized that despite everything, despite all the hurt and disappointment and years of feeling misunderstood, I still wanted their approval, still hoped that they could find a way to be happy for me, even if they couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. Once we were seated in the conference room with the door closed, I took a deep breath and began to tell her everything about meeting Alexander at the art gallery, about our courtship, and his proposal about the engagement ring that I had been hiding in my purse every time I visited the hospital, about the life I had been building in secret, while they assumed I was still the same unsuccessful single daughter they had dismissed at that awful dinner months ago. And with each revelation, I watched. Her expression changed from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like wonder, mixed with a peculiar kind of grief, as if she was mourning the daughter she thought she knew while trying to process the reality of who I actually was. "You're really engaged to a prince?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you've been living this incredible fairy tale life while we've been falling apart, and you never said anything, never gave us any indication that your circumstances had changed so dramatically, and I understand why you didn't tell us after the way we treated you. But Andrea, this changes everything. This means you could have helped us. You could have solved all our problems, and you chose not to, because you were angry at us, because you wanted us to suffer the consequences of being cruel to you, and I don't know how to feel about that. I don't know whether to be grateful that you're finally getting everything you deserve or hurt, that you let us struggle when you had the power to make it all go away." Her words contained both truth and misunderstanding, because yes, I could have helped them financially, but the reasons I hadn't weren't simply about revenge or punishment. They were about protecting myself from being used, about maintaining boundaries with people who had made it clear they didn't respect my choices or value my happiness, except when it served their purposes. And I tried to explain this to her, tried to help her understand that love isn't just about solving problems with money, that real reconciliation requires acknowledgement of harm done and genuine change in how people treat each other. But I could see that she was struggling to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about my life and my capabilities. "Mom," I said gently, "the reason I didn't tell you about Alexander isn't because I wanted you to suffer. It's because I needed to know that you could love and accept me without knowing what I could do for you. I needed to know that our relationship could be repaired based on genuine care and respect, rather than what I could provide in terms of financial security or social status. And I'm sorry that you found out this way. I'm sorry that reporters got to you before I could explain everything properly, but I'm not sorry that I protected my happiness and my peace of mind while I figured out how to handle a situation that had so many complicated dimensions." Before she could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door, and Jessica peeked in, looking frantic and excited, and completely overwhelmed by whatever she had just experienced in the hospital corridor. "Andrea," she said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her, "there are photographers everywhere, and they're asking me questions about you and some prince. And I just got off the phone with Mark, who says it's all over social media that you're engaged to Prince Alexander of Monaco, and people are posting pictures of you two together, and I'm trying to understand how this happened. How my sister, who I thought was struggling to find a decent man to marry, is suddenly engaged to actual royalty. And nobody in the family knew anything about it." I looked at both of them, these women who had been so confident in their assessment of my romantic prospects, who had been so sure that I needed to lower my standards and settle for whatever man would have me, and I felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness. Because while it was satisfying to prove them wrong about my worth and my possibilities, I also realized that their shock and confusion came from a place of genuine care, beneath all the criticism and judgment they had wanted me to be happy and secure. They had just had a very narrow understanding of what that happiness might look like, and now they were confronted with a reality so far beyond their expectations that they didn't know how to process it. Yes, I said simply, I'm engaged to Prince Alexander of Monaco. We met 3 months ago and he proposed 6 weeks ago, and I've been living in this amazing dream while trying to figure out how to share it with a family that had made it clear they thought I was delusional for believing I deserved something extraordinary. And I know this is shocking. I know it seems impossible, but it's real and it's happening. And in 2 months I'm going to be married in a ceremony that will be attended by heads of state and covered by media around the world, and I wanted to tell you when I was ready, when I felt like our relationships were stable enough to handle news this big, but obviously that decision has been taken out of my hands. Jessica sank into a chair, looking like she might faint, and Mom just kept staring at me like she was trying to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with this new version who was apparently living a life that belonged in fairy tales rather than real world. And I realized that despite all my anger and hurt, I felt sorry for them, because they were going to have to completely reimagine their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. And that kind of fundamental shift in perception is disorienting and painful, even when the new information is positive and exciting. Andrea Jessica said, "Finally, does this mean you're going to be a princess? Does this mean you're going to live in a palace? Does this mean our family is going to be connected to European royalty? And what does this mean for us, for our relationship, for everything that's happened between us? Because I don't know how to process this information. I don't know how to understand that my sister, who I thought needed my advice about men and marriage, is actually engaged to someone who could probably buy our entire town without thinking twice about the expense. Yes, I said it means I'm going to be a princess. It means I'm going to live in Monaco. It means I'm going to have responsibilities and obligations that I never imagined. And it means that our family dynamics are going to change in ways that we'll all have to navigate together if we can find a way to repair the damage that's been done to our relationships and move forward with mutual respect and understanding. But it doesn't mean I'm going to forget how you treated me when you thought I was ordinary and unremarkable, and it doesn't mean I'm going to pretend that money or status erases the need for genuine apologies and behavioral changes." Over the next hour, we talked through the immediate practical concerns, how to handle the media attention that was now focused on our family, how to protect Dad from stress while he recovered from his heart attack, how to manage the curiosity and speculation that would follow us for months as people tried to understand how an ordinary girl from Ohio had captured the heart of European royalty. And through it all, I could see them struggling to adjust their perception of me to accept that the daughter and sister they had dismissed was actually someone who had achieved something beyond their wildest imagination, and I realized that this revelation would either bring us closer together or drive us permanently apart, depending on how they chose to handle their shock and regret. When Alexander called that evening after I had returned to my hotel and spent hours fielding calls from reporters and photographers and distant relatives who had suddenly remembered my existence, he listened patiently as I described the chaos of the day, the confusion and excitement of my family, the complicated emotions I was feeling about having my private life exposed in such a public way, and he was characteristically calm and supportive, offering to fly to Ohio immediately to help me manage the situation and to meet my family under circumstances that were far from ideal, but which might actually work better than trying to orchestrate some perfect formal introduction. 2 days later, he arrived at the hospital, wearing simple clothes and carrying flowers for my mother and a book for my father, and he charmed everyone he met, from the nurses to the doctors to the security guards who were trying to manage the continued media presence outside the building. And when he walked into Dad's room and introduced himself with genuine warmth and respect, I watched my father's face transform from suspicion to acceptance, to something that looked like paternal pride as he realized that this polite, articulate young man who was clearly devoted to his daughter was nothing like the arrogant, entitled person he had expected a prince to be. "Your Highness," Dad said, struggling to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, and Alexander immediately asked him to please call him Alexander, and pulled a chair close to the bed so they could talk comfortably. And over the next hour, I watched my father and my fiancé discover that they had more in common than either had expected. Both men who took their responsibilities seriously. Both people who valued family and tradition. Both individuals who had learned that true strength comes from service to others rather than personal advancement. And by the time visiting hours ended, they were talking like old friends, and Dad was insisting that Alexander call him Robert and promising to be strong enough to attend our wedding, even if he had to be wheeled down the aisle. That evening at dinner with Mom and Jessica and their families, Alexander answered their questions about royal life with patience and humor, explaining that most of his days were spent in meetings and studying policy documents rather than attending glamorous parties that he had grown up with tremendous privilege, but also with the weight of knowing that his personal choices would always be scrutinized and judged by people who felt entitled to opinions about his private life. And he made it clear that he had chosen me, not despite my ordinary background, but because of the authenticity and independence that came from being raised by people who had taught me to work hard and value genuine relationships over superficial status. And gradually, I could see my family beginning to understand that their daughter hadn't been rescued by a prince, but had been chosen by a man who appreciated exactly the qualities they had raised her to possess. The next morning, before Alexander and I flew back to New York to begin the official engagement announcement process, Mom asked to speak with me privately, and I expected another conversation about how shocked she was by the revelation about my engagement. But instead she said, "Andrea, I need to apologize to you for things that go far beyond what we said at that dinner. I need to apologize for not seeing who you really were, for not recognizing your strength and your worth, for trying to make you smaller, instead of celebrating the fact that you were brave enough to dream bigger than the life we had imagined for you. And I need to ask for your forgiveness, not because you're marrying a prince, but because you're my daughter, and I love you, and I want to be part of your life going forward if you'll let me." Her words were everything I had hoped to hear for years. The acknowledgement of harm done, the recognition of my worth, the request for forgiveness that came from genuine remorse rather than desperate need. And I hugged her for the first time in months, feeling like we might actually be able to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than the conditional love that had defined our interactions for so long. And when she asked if there was anything she could do to help with wedding planning, I told her that what I needed most was her presence and her support, and her willingness to be proud of the woman I had become, rather than disappointed in the woman I had refused to be. 6 months later, I walked down the aisle of the cathedral in Monaco, wearing a dress that had been designed specifically for me by artisans who had worked for months to create something worthy of a royal wedding. And as I approached the altar, where Alexander was waiting for me, I could see my family in the front row, Dad in his wheelchair but smiling broadly, Mom wiping away tears of joy, Jessica and her children dressed in their finest clothes, and looking like they still couldn't quite believe they were attending a royal wedding. And I realized that the most satisfying part of this fairy tale ending wasn't the dress, or the cathedral, or the fact that I was marrying a prince, but the fact that I had refused to settle for less than I deserved, and in doing so had found not just love, but a family that finally understood that their daughter had always been worthy of something extraordinary. They had just needed to believe in her enough to see it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.